Hello and welcome to this GCSE Poetry Anthology clip based on the poem Hawk Roosting by Ted Hughes. As normal, we're going to look at the three assessment criteria, that is AO1, understanding what the poem is about, AO2, the language, form and structure, and AO3, the context. Please pause this video and take a look at the marking criteria in each column. Ted Hughes then. Some background information. Ted Hughes wrote the poem Hawk Roosting as one of his many poems about the raw beauty of the natural world. The poem could be said to be a reaction to some of the other GCSE poems that express romantic views of poetry and offers a non-romantic view of the animal. Ted Hughes was born in 1930 and so grew up as a child with the rise of the fascist rulers waging war across the world. The character of the hawk may be heavily influenced by some of those fascist rulers at the time, people such as Hitler, Mussolini, etc. Ted Hughes was asked many times what the poem was actually about. People thought the hawk was probably a symbol for something, representing something. His answer was always exactly the same. He always replied that the poem Hawk Roosting is about a hawk. Here's the poem itself then, and Ted Hughes himself reading it out.
I sit in the top of the wood, my eyes closed. Inaction, no falsifying dream between my hooked head and hooked feet. Or in sleep rehearse perfect kills and eat. The convenience of the high trees, the air's buoyancy and the sun's ray are of advantage to me, and the earth's face upward for my inspection. My feet are locked upon the rough bark. It took the whole of creation to produce my foot, my each feather. Now I hold creation in my foot, or fly up and revolve it all slowly. I kill where I please because it is all mine. There is no sophistry in my body. My manners are tearing off heads, the allotment of death. For the one path of my flight is direct through the bones of the living. No arguments assert my right. The sun is behind me. Nothing has changed since I began. My eye has permitted no change. I am going to keep things like this.
I've always particularly liked the line, "Now I hold creation in my foot." And that reminded me of a very popular children's nursery rhyme about God, some of which you're about to hear now.
He's got the whole world in his hands. 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 He's got you and me, brother, in his hands. He's got you and me, brother, in his hands. He's got you and me, brother, in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands.
As you can see, the lovely nursery rhyme there is all about God looking after us and caring for us, as if God is like a motherly figure who's going to look after us in our times of need. Hughes subverts this. We have a hawk here clutching us in its claw, as if he won't let go, the symbol of ultimate power. Now we're going to look at the poem itself and look at some of the details you might want to pull out in your exam answer. We have the repetition of the personal pronouns I and my, showing the hawk is only concerned for itself. This theme is repeated throughout the poem. The poem is a strong, regular form, which in itself helps express the strength and control the hawk has over its domain, in this case, the wood. The metaphor in the opening line is ironic. I sit on top of the wood, my eyes closed. The hawk suggests he looks like a symbol of justice. Depicted blindfold show the justice does not take sides. You can see there the hawk with his eyes closed, this picture of justice where he's not going to choose what's right and what's wrong. Yet the whole poem is the hawk's attempt to justify his actions, his killing, his murdering. There is one key sound that echoes through all the stanzas in the poem. This is the long E sound, here pointed at the word feet. For example, this sound can be found 4 times in stanza 1. This may suggest the only sound to be heard throughout the wood is the screeching of the hawk itself. Everything else is dead, or everything else is unimportant. The hooked head and hooked feet convey the danger, whilst perfect kills suggest arrogance and self-satisfaction. The first 2 stanzas are about the hawk's physical superiority. The middle of the poem. Hughes has capitalised the word creation in the second line there, a clear reference to the book of Genesis. The hawk is marvelling at its own superiority, proudly enjoying the idea that it took everything God had just to create his foot. Stanzas 3 and 4 reveal his power and how he holds everything, including life and death, in his claws. I kill where I please conveys the power of the hawk and how it holds that power over all other life. The poem is a dramatic monologue to tell us what this ultimate ruler is thinking, once again exaggerating its arrogance. It is all mine continues the trend of the hawk being above all else. It is an apex predator. The graphic description found in tearing off heads enhances the sense of violence and ruthlessness. And now the end of the poem. The allotment of death is a metaphor for what the hawk sees as he looks down on the fields below, countryside filled with creatures he could potentially kill. This could also imply that the hawk allots or grows death, as that is its passion. The full stop begs us to picture this gruesome image as we pause and mull over exactly what Hughes means. The enjambment here, you notice the line there is cut in 2 at the word direct. The enjambment here implies that nothing can stop the hawk. It carries on past the end of the line as it goes on killing. The final 2 stanzas form a kind of justification for the hawk's actions. It tries to explain why it does what it does. The sun is behind me feels to the reader as if the hawk believes he has the full support of nature. The sun, perhaps symbolising God, is behind the hawk, implying then that God agrees with the hawk, or Mother Nature agrees with the hawk's actions. The structure here takes us through different aspects of the hawk's thought process. It arrives where it began. The poem begins and ends with the lines beginning with I. This underlines the key idea of the poem. The hawk is a ruler who will continue to rule exactly how he pleases for years to come. The poem ends with a set of statements that imply almost a political manifesto, further exaggerating its dictator-like qualities. The key things to remember then about the poem Hawk Roosting. Who is it about? It is about a hawk who sits on top of a tree surveying his kills far below. What is it about? It simply describes its nature as the hawk simply describes its nature as a predator. The poem also works as a metaphor for people in positions of power who are a long way from the consequences of their actions. Why was it written? Hughes shows us that by sitting on top of the world with his eyes closed, the hawk is merely ignoring the consequences of his actions. Now we're going to look at some detail of the quotes themselves. You're going to see three in quite a bit of depth as we analyse individual words and look at the techniques some of them employ. But before I go on to do this, please pause this video and take a look at the four labelled on the board. You're on the screen. You can see each one of them is about 5 words long, perhaps at most 8 words long, and each one has been chosen for the techniques they use. Please take the time to write these quotes down and brainstorm around what you might write in the exam before pressing play on this video. Pause now. Now we're going to go on then to look at these quotes and see what you might have said. Quote number 1 then. Pause the video. Make any notes you need to. Quote number 2. And pause the video. And quote number 3. And pause the video. Today then, in our essay skills section of this video, we're going to look at how we link quotes. Remember, this is one of the key skills to get one of the highest grades on the marking criteria. You've been taught in probably many lessons by your English teacher how to zoom in on one part of a quote, looking at a particular word or analysing a quote. You've been taught how to look at word choices and think exactly why a word has been chosen by the writer, or in this case, the poet. This is an excellent skill and one you definitely need to prove you can use to get a high grade or a pass grade. But marks are also awarded for finding links between quotes and commenting on how effects are built as you read the poem or book. You can see here an example from Macbeth. We know enough about Macbeth to know that he is going to be ambitious in pretty much everything he says. If we then scan that answer and look for words that show ambition, there's a very high chance of us finding some, if not many, examples. This is something you would have done in Year 7. Imagine you being given a part of a horror book and we're asking you for words that mean it's scary. You'd probably be able to find at least 6 or 7. Poems are very, very similar to this. You can see I've now highlighted the words, or at least some of them, that might link to ambition. You'll notice that there is ambition throughout the whole extract. The length of the ambitious thought gets longer. You notice the first bit in yellow is quite short, but it gets longer as the extract continues. They also get more obvious. It's easier to spot the later quotes than it is the first ones. All of these are points you make about the structure of the poem, as well as doubling up as points about the language. We could do the same thing with the poem itself. We know the hawk is powerful. We know the hawk is violent. So we can scan through the poem and find quotes to justify that. Are some of these violent words repeated? Are there many groups of words that seem to fit a particular category? Have a look at your copy of the poem, highlight any words that perhaps link to power, highlight any words that link to violence, highlight any words that you think are particularly unusual or interesting. Here is part of the poem then. You can see I've highlighted certain words there that link to violence. My hooked head and hooked feet. Hooked remind me of fishing and the idea of killing. Perfect kills at the end of the first stanza. My feet are locked implies the idea of holding prey and holding it captive. I kill where I please. My manners are tearing off heads. The allotment of death. Through the bones of the living. All suggest something about the violence in the poem and the violent nature of the hawk. They can be found throughout the poem, aside from the last stanza where the hawk is justifying what it's doing. And then we can start making links between those words. What commonalities are there? We might notice the violence is all emotionless and cold. We can see the links to the violence grow and then suddenly disappear by the end of the poem. We'd expect there to be violence at the end of the poem, but curiously there isn't. All the acts of violence dictated in the poem or mentioned in the poem are all links to murder. If I was writing up those words then, I might look at actually pairing them off or putting them into small groups before I start explaining them. An example is on the right hand side. I mention at the beginning the name of the poet, and then I go on to try and explain why he might create particular word sets. Hughes deliberately builds on the graphic violent imagery throughout the poem. Then 3 quotes in yellow. Perfect kills, I kill, tearing off heads. This lexical set of simplistic verbs all emphasise the brutality of the hawk and its role as a predator. Yet, by the end of the poem, the violence is then controlled and absent, as if the hawk is turning its attention away from its kills and onto you as a reader, making us feel fear under the hawk's gaze. Notice I've got my technical language there, lexical set of simplistic verbs. A lexical set is a group of words that are all of the same class. For example, a group of adjectives that have something common, a group of verbs that have something in common. I've also mentioned where in the poem some interesting features lie. So I've got at the end of the poem written in my answer here. I've also linked to the reader. That's really important just to pass the test. I've got on you as the reader and then making us feel fear. Clearly telling the examiner, I understand that Hughes is trying to create an effect here on me as a reader and make me feel something as I read this poem about this hawk. Now, before I go on to the comparisons you can make with horse roosting, I will point out that you could use that same idea of classing words and looking at groups of words in any of the poems in the anthology. You could look for particular beauty words, perhaps in She Walks in Beauty, or perhaps some of the words linked to disgust in Death of a Naturalist. They make really interesting comparisons between the poems. So here's my advice then, which poems you might want to compare hawk roosting to. We have Death of a Naturalist, as it's about a non-romantic view of nature. We have Ozymandias, as it explores the theme of power. And it can contrast with most of the other nature poems. Many of the other nature poems all offer beauty and tranquility, and the idea of it being almost divine when you look at nature. This poem, Hawk Roosting, does pretty much the opposite. Thank you then for watching this video on the poem Hawk Roosting by Ted Hughes.